Well, yeah, thank you so much, Kate, for that introduction. Really excited to be speaking at the Perennial Farm Gathering. It's one of my favorite annual conferences. And so it's a real honor to be sharing about what's going on in the Pacific Northwest. So as Kate said, I'm Patrick Shults. I'm an extension forester with Washington State University. I run a program in Southwest Washington for forest and farm owners, and agroforestry has become a really big part of that. So what I'm going to start with is just a really sort of brief overview, introduction to kind of where we're at with agroforestry in the Pacific Northwest. Bear in mind, this is just my perspective, and there are multiple perspectives on what this looks like. But having worked in this area with some really amazing people, I think I've got some good information to get us started before we hand it over to Jared to talk more specifically about some actual farmers and what they're doing on the ground. All right, so real quick, I want to plug Agroforestry Northwest. This is another hat I'm wearing today. This is a nonprofit that we formed earlier this year, and I'm on the board for. Really excited about the future for Agroforestry Northwest and helping meet the fastly growing demand for agroforestry resources in the Pacific Northwest. So we have a website here. This started out of a local work group. As I said, we turned it into a nonprofit earlier this year. If you want to go to that website and check it out, you can sign up for our listserv and join our bi-monthly meeting. So we have a meeting next week, actually. So if anyone's in the Pacific Northwest and really interested in that, please feel free. Or if you're elsewhere in the world and want to join, you're more than welcome. All right, so more to the point, agroforestry in the Pacific Northwest, what's going on? It's kind of funny. I feel like when I talk to people that aren't from this area or aren't familiar, but, we're talking about agroforestry, I get one of two responses. And the first is, we do tons of agroforestry in the Pacific Northwest. It's everywhere. The other is there's no agroforestry in the Northwest. So of course, the actual answer is somewhere in between. And it really kind of depends on who you talk to. I think one of the reasons there's that fluctuation in response or perception of agroforestry out here is how we define it. I don't think we've created a shared definition in this region for what agroforestry is. A lot of times, just by way of how heavily forested the landscape is here, we get a lot of that incidental agroforestry, which, most of us here know that there's no such thing as incidental agroforestry. Agroforestry is intentional. But it bleeds into intentionality over time. And there's a lot of times I go and visit landowners, and it's that everlasting debate of, is this agroforestry? Is this just, trees in a farm kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of that, and that causes some confusion, but there is tremendous potential and tremendous interest in some really good examples of agroforestry, more true to the definition. And Jared's going to be sharing some of those shortly. But kind of backing out a little bit, the dominant land uses, in this area, forestry and rangeland. When people think of the Pacific Northwest, they certainly think of lots of big, tall Doug firs and lush, Pacific Northwest rain forests, and but there's a lot of agriculture as well, and of course urban and para-urban spaces, and it really depends on which side of the Cascades you're on. And if you've never been, you're not familiar with this area, the Cascades divide Oregon and Washington into east and west, and it's very different ecologically and socially, and depending on which side you're on. In the west, it tends to be more moist, and you get a lot more forestry, but a lot of small diversified farms, with the exception of the Willamette Valley that has, a lot of more bigger agriculture systems. And on the east side, it's drier, and you get a lot of more big industrial ag by way of irrigation. And I'll say too, Idaho and Northern California are traditionally part of the Pacific Northwest, but I'm going to talk more about Washington and Oregon because that's just where we tend to work. But yeah, I work mostly in Southwest Washington, and a lot of the work I've been doing with folks is in the western space, west of the Cascades, with small diversified farms, because they tend to be, the early adopters of stuff like agroforestry. And I want to point out that indigenous agroforestry is a really big part of the mosaic of agroforestry in the Northwest, and it's a really important piece. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later after Jared's session. So in terms of drivers of adoption, this may not look all that different from other parts of the country or world, but I wanted to kind of talk about what seems to be driving it here. Financially, I think farmers are really interested in diversification, certainly looking at supplemental income, and agroforestry offers a lot of that. Exploring new markets and then taking advantage of new financial incentives around agroforestry and adjacent practices. Environmentally and maybe a little more top down, a lot of institutions and agencies are really looking at agroforestry as a climate solution, also as a solution to these restoration and conservation efforts like salmon recovery. And I think Jared's going to talk a little about that with some landowners that are doing some really interesting stuff. From the landowner side, I think agroforestry is becoming a bigger part of the conversation out of way of climate adaptation. One example that I see of that all the time now is wanting more shade for grazing systems as we experience much hotter, drier summers. So I think silvopasture is going to be in high demand as we continue to experience hotter, drier summers, and we want to prolong grazing under some shade. And then I think in general, there's just shifting land management perspectives towards more sustainable systems. And I think that's happening everywhere, but it's certainly still happening here. So key challenges and opportunities. I'm just going to run through these quickly before I turn it over to Jared. We do have some challenges here. There is a lack of region-specific research and guidance. I am always giving out, handouts from the Savannah Institute, handouts from the University of Missouri, which are all awesome, great places with great information. But landowners, they want something that's specific to their region. And so we're really working hard to develop those resources and develop research that's specific and can help identify what agroforestry looks like in the Pacific Northwest. In that same vein, we have kind of a lack of demonstration sites available. I mean, I would really love to have a demonstration site in every county. That's a little bit pie in the sky, maybe 20 years down the line. But, we have some really great farmers that are offering their properties up for demonstration, but we certainly need more. And I'm really excited about the network of demonstration sites that's starting to occur through the Agroforestry Coalition. And I think, we can build that out here in the Pacific Northwest because people want to see agroforestry before they adopt it. As I mentioned, there's hotter, drier summers. We're feeling climate change in the Pacific Northwest, and our forests are feeling it. And we're also feeling it in terms of tree plantings. It's getting harder to establish trees, so it affects how we plant, when we plant, what we plant. We're having to adapt already to this situation. Regulatory and land use restrictions, I won't dig into that. Suffice to say, I think this happens everywhere when you're introducing agroforestry because policy hates a gray space, and agroforestry is kind of this gray space between ag and forestry. So working with policies and regulators can be a little difficult sometimes. And then there's this, what I've been calling a binary cultural perspective on land use that I don't, again, think is unique to this area, but having moved here from the Midwest and experienced this, it feels a little more strong of, some of these things like conservation and, restoration have gotten a little politicized, and it becomes this very dichotomous view between agriculture versus restoration. And it can be met with resistance when you suggest something that agroforestry that creates a nuance between those two things. I think this is fading, but it is certainly something that's out there. But more to the opportunities, I'm incredibly optimistic because we have significant interest among small and diversified farms. I feel like in the last 3 to 5 years, it's just really grown very quickly. A lot of people are interested in agroforestry. We have a climate that's really conducive to trying out a lot of different things, a lot of different species. Growing interest among local, state, federal programs and agencies. Before everybody hopped on, we were talking a little bit about some of the state policy in Washington that's specifically supporting agroforestry. That's really exciting. And increased resources for research, demonstration, and outreach efforts. Just kind of anybody that's worked in agroforestry and grants, seeing agroforestry called out in all these requests for proposals in the last few years is really exciting because even 5 years ago, that was pretty hard to find. So yeah, I'm really excited about the future for agroforestry in the Northwest. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Jared to share his slides on some of what individual farmers are doing. And I'll stop sharing, Jared, so that you can take over.
Okay. Thank you. Yep. Okay, looks like everybody should be able to see my screen now. So yeah, I am Jared. I work with one of the conservation districts over here. Just like Patrick, I'm actually also originally from the Midwest, so I'm familiar with some of the farming practices y'all use over there. But what I'm going to walk you through today is for people and how they're developing agroforestry in the Pacific Northwest and adapting it for the Pacific Northwest. We have a semi-Mediterranean climate here, which means we have really wet winters and really dry and hot summers. So we get all our rain during one period, and then we get no rain for a while. And that does create a lot of issues. The first person we're going to talk about is Nick Pate at Raising Cane Ranch. And he does creative expressions in trees. He's got a degree in architecture and biology, and he is developing his farm out to invite people to experience his farm in different ways. He cares about habitat, he cares about beauty, he cares about people. He's trying to develop his farm using agroforestry practices as a way of experiencing the land and reconnecting with the land. So Nick has about 30 acres. He originally was farming Highland cattle, and he is now transitioning out of that. So most of his land was devoted to hay production. As his cattle are phasing out, he's bringing in a U-pick system as well as a large apple cidery. He actually produces cider on site, sells it on site, has a nice little setup going there. So, and he's using alley cropping. As he's putting in the cider trees, he's leaving the rows in the middle for hay. And then as the apple trees come up, it's going to shade out the hay, which he's going to need less and less. He also has a food forest, a really nice riparian buffer, and he's using several of his areas as a windbreak, including a chapel that he is putting in. So he's going to talk about his cathedral that he put in with trees and what it means to him, why it's there, and how it's affecting the area.
Hi, welcome to the Living Cathedral at Raising Cane Ranch. It was planted in the spring of 2023. It came about through just circumstance and a chance placing of a wishing well on my property in the woods. I was trying to hide it and get rid of it, but as I approached it one day, I just saw the cottonwoods above it, sort of looking towerish, and the gate looking like a Gothic cathedral entrance. And with that kind of idea was born, and over the next couple months in the winter, when some people are planting their gardens and all the seeds and plants they're going to put in, I started dreaming up how I could put a cathedral here on the property. I'm in the process slowly the last couple of years phasing out my cattle. So my hay fields, which predominantly is the majority of my farm, are becoming less and less necessary, and I don't have a desire to continue doing hay and selling it. So this opportunity, this idea really appealed to me because I would like to transition out of hay and move into trees. On our property, we've already done that over the past 5-6 years. We have a couple of food forests. We have a lot of alley cropping where we're still doing hay, but we're also growing apples. So we have a natural kind of transition to forests, to trees, and I have kind of a love of trees. So this was really a fun, unique opportunity for me to build a cathedral out of trees and kind of envision how that would come about as far as columns being tree trunks and different trees along the edges becoming stained glass windows, either through the flowers that come about in the seasons or just the branching. I chose to plant predominantly with native plants, Doug fir, cedar, alder, Sitka spruce, western hemlock. Those are our major trees. And in some instances, when I was trying to pull out an element that was difficult with native trees, I would choose something like these emerald greens or arborvitae to kind of give this sense as we enter the cathedral of a wall or a facade. And then another element I came up with that was not a native, it's the Lombardy poplar. And that I pulled in mostly to give that Notre Dame kind of double tower in a short amount of time. Because my Doug fir, they're going to be my double tower. I was flanking two trees on each side. But I wanted to pull this poplar in, so in 10, 20 years, a person coming up could kind of get that sense of archway with two big towers. And then maybe 100 years from now, we have two big towers, but they're Doug firs. So succession was really a well thought out thing in this, that I have my deciduous trees and I have my evergreens, but I was thinking more into, 100 years from now, what the alder, they're going to need to be taken down, but we'll still have this cedar and Sitka spruce hemlock aisleway. A familiar element with cathedrals most people know about are flying buttresses and the outer wall, and how flying buttresses helped builders of old create these large stained glass windows. And one of the native trees I chose was the cedar. As it gets big and bushy, becomes more wall-like, and a grand fir, which if you don't prune the lower branches, it's kind of like a beautiful Christmas tree. So I wanted these elements on the outside to be solid, to not be more like a column, but more like a wall. And in the space in between, I chose, and it's not the perfect time here in fall, but I chose some native flowering plants like the Nootka rose and the red flowering currant. And then I have a 9 bark over here. I tried to alternate it, so there's kind of if you walk down the side aisle, these spaces in between, they're going to be random. There'll be flowers in different times of the spring and summer, and it'll just be sort of a unique experience similar to a real cathedral. So as we leave the main entrance and we come to the side aisles, which are braced mainly by 2 rows of evergreens with a middle columns of alder, and I spaced these alder kind of staggered with the evergreens. And in doing that, I noticed after the fact that I had kind of left a vacant space. And then I came across an architect's statue who I really love, these sprites by Frank Lloyd Wright, which originally were designed for the Midway Gardens in Chicago. And then it just so happens by chance that the people who produced these, Nichols Brothers, is just 10 minutes drive from my place. And they mentioned that they often make slight defects to these statues that they don't want to send. And so I happened to get some statues 6 feet tall that were just perfect for this site. So we're now in the main rotunda, or the dome space. I picked four Doug fir at each corner here to one day hopefully get tall enough to create a very high dome. And now the cathedral, from just the first glance, it doesn't seem like it has any place in agroforestry. I don't imagine my cows grazing in here. This isn't silvopasture. It's not really a food forest because there's only maybe the huckleberry are the only edible plants out here. I don't plan on getting any timber from this. And the one thing it could possibly be in the traditional sense of agroforestry is maybe a windbreak. On my farm, that's south, that's north. I have an orchard here, I have hay fields here. Wind predominantly comes in through the south. It's going to protect my farm in the future from wind. There's an orchard all around us, and with rows of trees, and then there's a hay field. The field goes on to the waterways. And there's a hill up in the background with lots of trees. We've planted trees along a waterway back there, and we've planted a lot of our other agroforestry projects, a quarter mile away. And this cathedral, it ties things together to some extent. It adds a lot of vertical space, obviously, in the next 20 years. Already, within just days of planting this, we had robins alighting on the alders. Birds were coming here with the flowers, the insects. It fits, as much as it seems like it stands out, it actually fits. And it takes away from hay fields, it takes away from something that I really don't need anymore. And it adds just a an amazing, unique element to the whole farm. And whether that's for the birds and the beasts, or it's humans that come into our U-pick orchard and our cidery, and they walk the fields, they walk our trails, and they see this space, or chance be it that they would like to have a ceremony here. It adds so much to the farm, and I think I didn't see that in the beginning. I just saw what I kind of wanted to create, but in doing it, it's added such a diverse amount of opportunity and beauty to our farm. Hi, welcome.
Sorry, okay, so that was Nick discussing his cathedral. That planting was put in place about a year ago. He's already had multiple requests for weddings and even one request for a funeral to be held within his cathedral. And obviously the trees are still pretty short, but you can imagine once they're over 100 feet tall, how beautiful that space is going to be. And when you go out on this property, there's a lot of U-pick for raspberries, apples, currants, aronia, a huge variety of fruits and berries. And so you can go through the U-pick, and then you can meander through this cathedral that he planted, which then connects to another orchard, which then leads back to his riparian buffer, which is this picture that's inset there. And the riparian buffer actually has a trail system that goes through it. If you follow the trail system through along the riparian buffer, and there are edible plants along the way, it then kicks you out into a food forest, which is the image on the left that was planted in March. So he is slowly building up his connection of trees, improving habitat, shading out the land, but providing a lot of new opportunities for himself and for anybody that comes out and visit his property. His main thing is trying to get people to reconnect with the land through experiences. So he now has his riparian buffer that connects to a food forest. So we have a nice productive riparian buffer, along with a cathedral, along with U-pick, along with apple cider that he develops, and anything left over from the U-pick, those berries and other fruits go into his apple cider production. So you can get really unique and interesting flavors that are all developed on his property. Before we move on to the next couple farmers, I'm going to talk about a program that's going on here called Wet Feed Farming. And this is a specialty crop block grant through Washington State Department of Agriculture. It's specifically trying to apply agroforestry practices to newly emergent marginal fields on farmlands. You can see in this picture here, this is a saturated soil. This is not an uncommon site here as far as farmland goes. And I know the issue exists back in the Midwest too. I watch plenty of corn and soybean fields be flooded out and massive crop loss. So we have very saturated soils here. So we're trying to figure out what is viable in farmland like this. So we need crops to tolerate high water tables, standing water, overall wet conditions, and then they might dry out in the summer. So we're looking for agronomic and economic viability, marketing potential, and growth. The main three crops we're focusing on is aronia, cider apples, which I'll talk about more later, and basketry willow. So we have aronia, cider apples. The cider apples we're actually grafting onto a native Pacific crabapple that has rootstock that can tolerate the conditions in the soils here. But then we're putting grafting cider apples on top of that. And then also basketry willow. So the next farmer I'm going to introduce y'all to is Dave, and he runs Rooted Northwest. And his big thing is community access to farmland. He'll go through and explain his model behind that. As far as the wet feed farming goes, he has large aronia plots and is developing a basketry willow plot. And he's focusing also on pawpaw and hazelnuts. He's got several agroforestry practices. He's alley cropping and forest farming are the two main ones, and he's trying to expand out into the rest as well. The image on the left, he's got about 240 acres, and it's set up for community access. I'll show a picture later. He's got a small village that he's setting up. Basically, if you buy into the village, you get access to a bunch of farmland. Not only is it just your typical farmland, He's also got major forested areas within the property. So there's a lot of room for shade-grown crops, forest farming, mushrooms, all kinds of stuff you can grow on that. And then any infrastructure is set up to be communal. So they've got a giant wash rack that anybody can use. They've got a refrigerated truck that anybody on the property can use to go out. Any tractors, barns, outbuildings, all that is communal space. So it's co-housing and co-farming. And I will let Dave take it from here.
My name is Dave Bainline, and I am a permaculture educator and designer.
Okay, I'm going to come out.
One of the aspects of that I'm most passionate about, and that passion started back when I went to the University of Minnesota in the late 90s, early 2000s. I studied resource management. After college, I ended up landing at a permaculture farm, the Bullocks Permaculture Homestead out on Orcas Island in Washington State. And while I was there, in addition to annuals and building projects and livestock, a big component of what we did was perennial systems. And I got real passionate real quick about different kinds of sort of unusual edible plants, things like that. And fast forward 7 years after I lived there, I headed out, have a permaculture design company, help people figure out systems for their farms. And as of 2020, along with a group of people, came into possession of 240 acres of former dairy farm. And so this is kind of the opportunity to take agroforestry into a much bigger context and see what we can really do with it here in the Pacific Northwest. Rooted Northwest is a project that several of us started, and it sort of pivots around three major themes. One of those themes is farmland preservation. So here at this land you're looking at behind me, it looks like a big old farm, and it is a big old farm. However, it is zoned R5, which means residential 5 acre. So what its highest use, according to the appraisals world, would be for carving it up and turning it into big houses with big lots. So when we talk about farmland preservation, what we're talking about is looking for ways to make that not happen. Getting in between a conventional developer and this property. And save it, for farming in perpetuity. The second piece of that is residential co-housing community. So the idea is to look for ways that we can incorporate housing. So we can have farmers working this land, living on this land, people stewarding this land over the long haul. But can we create a development model that doesn't consume the whole farm or sprawl across the whole thing? So by doing a co-housing community with very tightly clustered dwellings, that's kind of what we're aiming for. And we should be able to preserve over 90% of the ground here. And keep it in farming and forestry. When you get a house here as a farmer, not only do you get post-harvest infrastructure, right? We have a wash pack. We're planning to have a market stand, dry storage, cold storage. We've got a refrigerated van. We've got two tractors. We've got equipment. All that stuff can be shared amongst other people. So instead of going maverick and buying your own thing and setting it all up all by yourself, this is what it looks like if we take a more community-based go at farming. The alley cropping system that we put in conjunction with the Snohomish Conservation District is one that is experimental, and it's specifically trying to explore what do you do with wet ground. It was existing hay fields, much like you see behind me, and we went to a particularly wet area and said, what if we did an alley cropping system where the alleys are continuing to be hayed, right? So we have strips of hay going through, and then we have rows of tree and shrub crops going through it. So it's sort of 30-foot wide alleys with then rows of trees. And in those rows, we've got all of our woody plants on 6-foot centers. And the bulk of the system is aronia berries, which we were pretty excited about. Because I have experience growing aronia berries, super low maintenance, beautiful fall color, beautiful flowers in the spring, attractive berries, like they're ornamentally really spectacular. Very few pests that I've encountered. In addition to those, for each of the larger tree and shrub crops, we got experimental. And when we dug the hole to put the hazels in, for example, in the same hole, we found a native species here in the Pacific Northwest called Myrica gale. It is a wetland nitrogen fixer. Sweet gale is a common name for it. We stuck one of those in the same hole as the trees and larger shrubs in order to see if we could get the roots to mingle, get a bunch of nitrogen fixation going, help boost the soils right around those plants. And in particularly in the case of the pawpaws, to also provide them a little shade while they're younger. The idea is that we would have sort of lush Myrica gales, and then the pawpaws would grow out of them with time. And so those are kind of the mainstays, the main components of the system. In addition to those, we've put in a handful of helper plants. I think we ended up with oregano and lovage and rhubarb, yes. And the reason we chose those is because they fall into plant families that happen to be particularly good nectar sources for pest predator insects. We figured right off the bat, can we decrease our pest issues by making sure we have a full complement of pest predator insects? In addition to that, if we start to look at sort of the full breadth of what agroforestry has to offer, we've got the alley cropping system down here right now. I think that many different forms of agroforestry could make sense here. We are currently talking about the possibility of doing a forest farming system, seeing what works and how can we get it going. Right behind me, we happen to have a hillside that's full of maples. So if we wanted something that provided us any sort of reasonable analog to an East Coast climate or an East Coast ecosystem, that would be right behind me. So we're talking about the possibility of doing some sort of forest farming system over there to see how it goes. We've already got a few things in there. We've got ramps, for example, seeing how they do here, if the slugs are too hard on them or not, that sort of thing. But forest farming, I think, is something we could definitely look at, and we could definitely do some really cool things. I think silvopasture would be really exciting to do here. I think some of our ground lends itself to it. We actually have a piece at the very south of the parcel we bought that got cleared in the 90s for a subdivision, and they sort of left a few standing trees here and there. So lo and behold, it looks kind of like a savanna. So we figured, what if you had livestock ranging there? We enriched the tree layer. We're exploring what we can do. We have a couple ideas. We have an area that we plan to reforest, and we're curious if we would be allowed to reforest it into Gary Oak savanna so that we could range pigs underneath it. We're curious if we could reforest it into a black locust coppice system to grow our own fence posts. I don't know how much we can do in terms of our capacity, but the non-farming people here also have the ability to establish systems, right? That's what the agroforestry system down here that we did with the conservation district is all about, right? We've got a 3-acre alley cropping system now that started. It's being managed by the community at large. My hopes are that someday somebody will take it over as a part of their livelihood and steward it. That's a lot easier to do if it's already established, because it's that establishment period that you have before you start to get any sort of payback out of some of these systems. That's the tricky part for getting perennials going and paying a lease and all that kind of stuff. So we're looking at different ways to do it, and we're totally open to other advice on better ways we can do it as well. My name.
So sorry about some of the audio there. That's what happens when you have somebody like me, not a pro videographer and not access to a lavalier mic. But for the most part, I think everything was understandable. The main time that the wind noise was the worst, he was talking about, so this entire outline in yellow is their property, and it's all zoned to be split up into 5-acre chunks. So instead, they're going to concentrate all the housing in this one area, and then what's labeled as the village site, and then the rest will be able to remain as farmland. The next farmer we're going to talk about is Eric, and he runs Northwest Meadowscapes. And a big thing is several things have made him very successful, but the main thing we're going to focus on is his ability to work with the land that he has. He's also part of the wet feed farming, so he's growing aronia, but the main thing he's focusing on as far as our program goes is he's growing old world cider apples grafted onto our Pacific crabapple rootstock. trying to develop a cidery here and trying to really grow a bunch of, and he'll talk about it, a bunch of apples, old French variety of apples here. But his main source of income right now is actually selling native seeds, which he will also go into the videos. So he's doing a lot of experiments with grafting old flavored apples onto, like I said, the Pacific crab apple, which is a native facultative wet plant that we have growing here. He has tried various things of planting bare root stock of Pacific crab apple, letting it grow, and then grafting on at various heights, planting established, potted Pacific crab apple, and then grafting on at various heights, just seeing what he can do. His main source of apples is actually goes around the state and looks for abandoned apple orchards, and then looks for volunteer apples that have grown there. And these are all proving to be very pest and disease resistant. So any apples that have just volunteered and grow themselves and are already well established, he's taking cuttings from those and then trying to develop his cidery from there. If you are a big apple nerd, these are the varieties he's growing. Most of these are English flavors. So if you're used to like the sweet palate that we have over here, these are going to be a little more stout, a little more like adultish flavors, so to speak, a little more mature. Maybe not some cider for a 5-year-old, but as adults, probably going to have a nice mature taste. And he will go through and talk about his land, why he picked it, and what he's going to work with. He is going to talk about one specific tree about halfway through, and it's called an Ashmead's kernel. It's an apple tree that was growing in an area that just inspired him, impressed him, and you'll see what the tree looks like as he goes through it. But he's going to talk about the land, how he found it, why he came across it, and then what he ended up doing with it.
We were going to plant an orchard here. We didn't want this land because apples don't grow well in wetland. But it was all we could afford. It was the only thing on the market. And somewhere along the way, we noticed the wild camas in that meadow. And we thought, well, we could harvest that and sell that. And then we noticed the wild crab apples in the hedges, and we knew that those were wetland plants, and we thought, well, we could just graft onto those, and then we have an orchard. You can see how that
I think that's good.
fits.
Yes.
Okay, there's spaces in there.
Yes.
But we're
Now
going to
you're
cinch
going to
that
tie
down.
it. Mm-hmm.
And see, I dipped the tip in wax.
Yeah.
I've got
the buds are the right angle.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-ish
Nice.
buds on there.
Okay. Well, you're going to wrap that one bud, so.
So you really want like as much of the cambium touching as possible.
Yes. And now there's no such, try not to rip into the bark, of course, but there is really not such a thing as too tight.
Okay.
With this.
Together.
Yeah. So, let's see. Tight.
Yeah. Okay. Is better, Eric?
It's better. You'll end up trimming that tongue.
Oh, right. I could use
That's fine.
Okay.
Tight. And you can use more than one rubber band if needed. But tight.
Yep. Yeah. Don't want any air in there.
So that doesn't wiggle too much. It's pretty
Okay.
good.
But you can do another
Oopsie.
rubber band if needed.
Yep.
Okay. Cool.
That's,
Are you gonna keep these guys in pots for?
I'm gonna get them in the ground as soon as I can.
Oh, okay.
And I usually just pull some of this, tear it, and then just like the rubber band, tight, tight, tight. Sometimes you'll go through all this wrapping work and then you'll feel it and it wiggles again. And then you should just start over. And this is more parafilm than I needed, but.
And that also keeps moisture in.
Yeah, it'll keep it from drying out.
Yeah.
And the wax.
So not a lot of wiggle. This is giant camas. This is the only population of giant camas that I know of on Whidbey.
Wow.
And we were looking at the place the first year in the winter time, and I kicked some vegetation, and I heard it rattle, and I knew what the sound was, and I looked down and it was a camas seed pod, and I was just kind of dumbfounded by that. And we looked around in the springtime, there was no camas that we could see out here, and then we fenced off one section of it with temporary deer fencing the second year, and it all came up in camas. Course of figuring, well, we could like just pick seed and grow seed and sell seed. And so Madi has a shop in downtown Port Townsend, and that a lot of what we forage over here ends up being sold. I like being out here because I see all these like weird living things. I had a piebald deer that lived here last year that I don't like the deer. But it was interesting to see. We've got 3 or 4 different color morphs of garter snakes, including the blue ones that I find like just dazzling to look at. I don't know, so should we look at the hedge?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's walk down there.
And the hedge, I will point out, goes almost all the way to the ditch on the road up there. But I like the central plan of it, which is that there are these major anchoring trees, and then those are, I think there's 5 big leaf maples, and then on 20-foot spacing between the maples, we've put in the Meadowscapes, the Pacific crab. Now we have the spaces between the crabs that we want to fill in. This has all been sprayed for a full growing season. There's still weeds in it, but there's probably many pounds of seed that I've already put in here that we can just trample on and walk through. And I'm going to keep reseeding this after we get it planted, just to outcompete whatever weed seed is in the soil here. And so you'll walk through and you'll see, like, I mean, there's camas bulbs.
Yeah, it's hey.
I've just tilled camas bulbs in here. And I have way more camas bulbs that we can plug plant into this as well. This remarkable tree, which is riddled with borers and woodpecker damage and has fallen over and collapsed, produces the most marvelous disease-free apples. And it just lives back here. You can see it's bare ground underneath there because the deer will just park themselves there during the apple fall.
Okay, so yeah, he talked about the ash meets kernel at the very end. He's doing alley cropping right now, where the main rows are the old world cider apples grafted onto Pacific crab apple, which again is our native rootstock, and then in the middle, in between them, he's growing native seeds. And the native seeds, for the most part, he found them all on his property. And instead of spending the money to drain the saturated farmland that he bought, He's instead adapting the plants to the farmland he has. So he's actually really economically viable because he didn't spend money draining and tiling and doing all the normal stuff. He invested in developing cider apples that will grow on the property and then also utilizing all the native seed that was there already. His biggest expense is probably going to be deer fencing, not infrastructure like most farmers have. And the last person we're going to talk about is Paul, and he uses Regenerative Riverscape Agroforestry. And our keynote speaker today is Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, and her work is directly contributing to and inspiring everything that Paul is going to talk about. A direct quote from her is, "Repair of ecosystem structure and function alone is insufficient. Restoration of a respectful, reciprocal relationship to the natural world is also essential for long-term success." So Paul is working on a system to try and use agroforestry and some other models to reconnect people to the land, to improve our connections with the land and our love of the land and improve stewardship. He's actually practicing, we're doing camping weekends where we will spend a weekend on site doing various agroforestry practices, doing restoration work, trying to improve habitat. One of the models he's trying to develop out is we've got a trailer that we can just pull around, do any site that has a small little kitchenette on it. It's got all the tools we need. It's all general hand tools. Lay out, have a nice communal space for people to relax. And while we're working on improving and restoring the habitat, we can then also just kind of hang out, learn from each other, have conversations. There's a lot of education that goes on. And again, it's all trying to tie back to connections with the land. Paul is going to talk about it here. This is actually a recorded presentation that he wanted us to share because he felt this is what most symbolizes what he's trying to do.
Hello, my name is Paul Ferragino. I'm a federal marine habitat specialist with a background in vegetation, ecology, and landscape construction. And this is a recorded version of a presentation I've been giving to partners to define a problem and a strategy for working towards restoration of aquatic habitat in Puget Sound, starting in the lower Skykomish watershed. I suspect that our riparian zone problem in ecosystem recovery is larger than we would like to think. When I look at our riparian zone, I'm going to actually go and look at it, and I ask myself, how do we regenerate biomass and biodiversity on over 1 million acres of land around the streams and wetlands of lowland Puget Sound under climate change and population growth, and protect and tend that landscape forever as it recovers its ecological integrity? I would suggest that this is not just a question of enough cash resources or more governmental interventions, even though government efforts and cash will play a key role. There are cultural explorers like Dr. Robin Kimmerer who have coined the term biocultural restoration, where we achieve restoration by restoring relationships. Using their language, biocultural restoration is the science and practice of restoring not only ecosystems, but human and cultural relationships to place, so that cultures are strengthened and revitalized, along with the lands to which they are inextricably linked. So whether we're talking about a Hawaiian afupua'a or Camas Prairie or Iberian oak savanna, restoration is reinventing the relationships necessary for people to become stewards. This requires restoring not only ecosystems, but human and cultural relationships to place. We are inextricably linked, and the evidence is all around us. And so as I imagine my culture, I can imagine many entry points back into relationship with something like a river forest. Relationships that are rich and durable and that have meaning. I think we'll be drawn to the work of restoration So what does biocultural restoration look like in a lowland Puget Sound forested corridor in the middle of an industrial nation state that replaces wetlands with holes of ivy? I expect that it will involve many more people doing work through which they can create meaning, where we are exploring and learning in a community, creating useful things. I think that's what people do. For better or for worse, a large portion of riparian restoration to date has been about either incentivizing or coercing people with money or regulation. And I suspect that money and regulation will remain very important starting points, but that they do not replace a strong human and cultural relationship with place, and that our culture must be strengthened and revitalized along with the lands to which we are inextricably linked. So this cultural project hinges on creating more relationships. Can we bring more relationships into the riparian zone while achieving more artful restoration? This could be interpreted as opening the floodgates to more destructive consumer recreation. That's exactly what I would like to avoid. Looking at it from another perspective, our conservation industry has a long history of removing societies from the land to restore an idealized wilderness. For example, at the beginning of the National Park Service, we forcibly removed Miwok and Paiute families to create Yosemite National Park. So destructive recreation is coming at us whether we like it or not. And I'd ask, how can we channel our human hunger for connection with nature into a mutually beneficial relationship? I think this is the challenge of biocultural restoration. How do we create meaning and value in the lives of many people, whether it's through appropriate camping or growing food or materials or studying ecology, plants, or ancestral skills, or as reparations for broken treaties, or just the logic of growing a river forest so that it produces the seeds and cuttings we need to restore more river forest? Fitting all this into a riparian landscape requires easy relationships among many people and between people and specific parcels of land. It has to be easy. See, in our culture, it's easier for me to walk to a store down the street and buy cigarettes and alcohol produced 5,000 miles away than it is for me to restore a river forest. This is easy because we have created the infrastructure. We have cleared the path, we've broken trail, and we've built the social infrastructure to support the behaviors we value. We have not done this for the river forest, and the results are plain to see, but most people can't even go and easily look. So I propose we have somewhat of a chicken or the egg problem here, and that we can't imagine a relationship we're not in, and we can't get into a relationship that we can't imagine. No one said that social projects are easy. I would suggest that our first challenge is design. We don't yet cultivate diverse river forests, and the evidence is right down there on the river. You can go look. I would like to slow down and invite more people into a design process. I would propose that if we design carefully and in the field based on the needs of actual sites, I would like to gather up interested free agents in the form of ecologists and agroforesters, foresters, restoration practitioners, foragers, tribal partners, and qualified students of biocultural restoration. We could divide into teams, but work from shared design resources and shared site assessments. And we would mentor ourselves through a structured design process where we get feedback from our clients, and our clients are both landowners and the river and the forest, and get to interact with other teams working to solve this design challenge. Ultimately, we would get to apply our best designs to practical work. Both new information and research and the results of ongoing work inform the shared design resources that we would have available for the next round of design. So this effort becomes a learning process, and it's expanded over time to other sites and other groups so that each year we're better prepared and better resourced for restoration of riverine forest. So this big vision, we'll take a project plan and systems and schedules and events and efforts and partnerships and collaboration. But I would propose that at first, it's going to take some imagination. If these ideas of biocultural restoration in river forests speaks to your imagination, I would be grateful to hear from you. I hope you will join me in exploring some individual sites, and my email is below. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
So Paul is trying to figure out how to bring agroforestry into biocultural restoration. Like I said, tying people back to the land. How do you develop a culture of restoration? This is an image of one area they're working on. The thing circled in the top left corner is actually an old railroad trestle. And between where the photographer is standing and the trestle is all invasive Japanese knotweed and invasive Himalayan blackberry. After some work and a few months later, this is the same site. This is, you can still see the trestle in the top left again. So here we're using the invasive species, the Japanese knotweed, as alley cropping practices. The width that we're setting these at is actually the width of a scythe. That way, just as a person comes through with hand tools, as you do the cut and do the windthrow, you start developing the alley cropping system. This is still currently going on. We're still actively working on this site, but eventually we will be planting in trees and creating succession of understory. And we're working with the owners of the land, which is one of the local tribes, to ensure that we're putting in plants that they want. We're putting in and working in collaboration with them. And while we're doing all these restoration sites, we're also, in the far left picture, that's an invasive species, English ivy, and we're using that to create baskets. So everybody there learned a new skill and also removed invasive species at the same time, and now we can make baskets out of them. In the middle is the Pacific Northwest only native wild cucumber, and its seeds we found all over one of the sites. That's currently, those seeds have now been distributed to a few other sites. So we're taking native seed stock and using it to regenerate other areas. I also have a whole bunch currently cold stratifying in a fridge that will then go on to use more restoration sites. The plant on the far right, snowberry, it's another native plant. It spreads rhizomously. So again, we're going to take we'll cut some of the rhizomes out and then use that stock to plant in other areas to, again, improve riparian buffers and improve habitat. So we are developing different ways of using the native stock on site, trying to develop ways to encourage people to come out and partake in regenerative riverscape agroforestry. We've had people arrive from Maine to these events. We've had people come up from Las Vegas to these events, Oregon, all over the place. And of course, we have a bunch of locals. So what the practices that are trying to be developed out is, how do you take agroforestry and biocultural restoration and actually have it work here? So we're doing camping events, and we're going to start experimenting with just like day-long events. But for the most part, these have all been, you show up on a Friday, you get to camp on the site that you're restoring, which is kind of nice. It's not an opportunity most people get. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it back over to Patrick so that he can continue on. And so Patrick, you should be able to take control again. Awesome.
Okay. Does that look all right? You give like a thumbs up. All right, I'm assuming. Okay. All right. So I'm going to wrap things up here. Thank you, Jared. That was awesome. I hadn't seen all those videos yet either. So I've been to some of those sites, and it was a really good way to capture some of the cool work they're doing. But I'm gonna wrap up and kind of move through this quickly and hopes to get done by around 9:15, and then we can leave the time for questions and transitioning to the next session. But I want to talk about a couple other projects that are going on in the area to highlight some WCU extension work that I'm involved with, and some interesting, in the same vein of like agroforestry innovations going on in the Pacific Northwest. But as I mentioned earlier, indigenous agroforestry is a really big component of agroforestry in the Northwest. It's arguably the backbone. And someone shared earlier a really neat article about a food forest that they found in British Columbia, like a pretty ancient food forest. I really recommend reading that because it kind of is a little peek into what agroforestry looked like, prior to European settlement in this region. So there have been some really cool efforts to sort of acknowledge and document the role of indigenous agroforestry in this region, and this is one of them, the Pacific Northwest Indigenous Agroforestry Story Map. That's a long, convoluted link there, but if you Google that, you should be able to find it, and I really encourage you to check that out. This was not a project I was involved with, but it was funded by the National Agroforestry Center, and there's multiple, university partners in the region and tribal partners that put this together. And this is a slide from it just to show some of the examples of the cool sort of ways that indigenous communities have managed the natural environment for food, fiber, and medicine. So I won't dig into this too much, but really, really encourage you to go and check out that story map. In that same vein, kind of building on that past effort, there's a new project led by EcoTrust that I'm involved with. It's really exciting, and it's going a step further to sort of support indigenous agroforestry and support indigenous communities to be able to communicate and share the knowledge and sort of rebuild some of that tradition, I guess, that has been lost over the last several hundred years. And this involves a needs assessment to understand what kind of resources tribes need, developing an indigenous agroforestry community of practice, which we may be transitioning into just the Indigenous Agroforestry Network. Connecting with federal programs for increased adoption, developing tools and stuff like that. So this is led by EcoTrust and Stephanie Gutierrez, who is, I believe, going to be on a panel later, although I don't know which, so I know that's not very helpful. But she's been really awesome to work with, and she's leading this project. And hopefully you can catch her in one of the later sessions and maybe ask a little bit more about this project. But there's a Google site there as well that you could check out and follow this project as it develops. It's still in like the first year, so it's a little bit early. All right, so I want to transition and just talk about forest farming in the Pacific Northwest as a forester and an avid agroforestry enthusiast. I think naturally forest farming is going to be my calling, and it really is where I've kind of focused a lot of my efforts in my extension program. And one of the reasons for that is I just think there's just such tremendous potential for forest farming in this region. Some of the farmers that Jared was highlighting mentioned this as well. There's just a lot of exciting opportunities, but there's not that many examples here currently. And I think one of the reasons for that is there's a long history of wild foraging, mushrooms, huckleberries, greenery, boughs, stuff like that. And there's significant established markets around that. So there just hasn't been, there's such abundance there. I think there hasn't been that much, attention paid to the possibility of intensively managing for some of these products or other native and non-native products or crops that could be forest farmed. And I think that presents really strong opportunities for small forest owners and small farms in this region. And we have really productive forest land, lots of small forest owners and unutilized farm woodlots, and a variety of viable crops that could be grown here. So I want to start with one project that I'm very excited about, been working on for a few years with some really great partners, big leaf maple syrup. When you think of the Pacific Northwest, you definitely don't think of maple syrup. But in the last 3 or 4 years or so, University of Washington, us at WCU Extension, Oregon State University developed this tri-university partnership to develop sugaring practices using our native big leaf maple. Prior to, around 2020, there was no commercial production, just some hobbyists doing this in the backyard. But now we have a handful of commercial producers in the region. It's really exciting. One of the reasons that it improves value of maple dominant stands, if anyone's familiar with this region, big leaf maple's a weed. It's eradicated in favor of Doug fir and cedar and more timber, higher value timber species. But big leaf maple has tremendous ecological benefits, not in riparian areas and upland areas. And so this adds value to those stands. And I'm really excited at that from like a native ecology perspective. How can we improve the cultural value or perceived value of big leaf maple? So we have no fantasies of outcompeting, sugar maple industry, multi-million-dollar industry. It'd be small scale cottage food production. There's also a lot of opportunities for hobby markets and agritourism, but there really is good opportunity for sort of supplemental income for farmers. I'm not going to go through all of these just in hopes to save some time here, but there's some unique challenges and opportunities around big leaf maple syrup production. One of them is that it's a low sugar content. It's lower than sugar maple. It's about half, so you need twice as much sap. But thanks to stuff like reverse osmosis, it makes big leaf maple syrup production possible. We have mild winters with unpredictable freezes. We know we'll get freezes, we just don't know when. So we're kind of inverted from the East Coast, where we're waiting for the freeze instead of waiting for the thaw. Mild winters also means more bacteria growth, so we're dealing with that. We don't have any local equipment suppliers, and it gets really expensive to ship evaporators and RO machines from the East Coast. So we're really working on developing local equipment manufacturing. And then a long history of treating big leaf maple as a weed tree. I mean, it just means that there's less maple, but because it's so weedy, and kind of switching over to the opportunities here, the weedy traits of big leaf maple make it amazing because there's fast growth, multiple stems, it coppices really well, easily dominates stands when people haven't been quote unquote managing it correctly. So you get these maple dominant stands that people have, and then they're just primed for tapping. It also has a very unique flavor and a very unique market, and it's going for about $4 an ounce right now. And it might not always go for that, but there's really a lot of appreciation for it as a local Northwest product with a unique flavor and unique applications. So this is a model that the University of Washington created. They really got the whole ball rolling on big leaf maple syrup production here through a grant from the ACER program, and some of their early research helped produce this model, which has been really helpful in assisting people that are interested in commercial production. And this site this is where I am, and I manage a site for Washington State University that participated in their research, and now I operate it as a demonstration forest. And here's some pictures of that. Again, just talking about like the weedy nature of big leaf maple. You get so many stems. We have less sugar than sugar maple, but we have these trees that just produce so many stems that you can tap, and it's kind of makes up for that difference a little bit. This is the quote unquote sugar bush. I have about 10 acres, but you can see it's just all of this sort of coppiced multi-stem maple stuff, and there's just I don't tap all of this just because it's just for demonstration, but I could have a lot of taps out there. And so, as I said, this is set up for, small scale hobby production to small scale commercial, just introducing people the idea of like tubing systems and vacuum, and, getting people affiliated with the concepts of big leaf maple syrup production, because this is not a thing that happens in this region. You didn't grow up putting buckets and bags on big leaf maple out here. So we've had a lot of really great workshop opportunities, and these sell out instantly. And then with wait lists for multiple other workshops, I'm pretty sure I could be doing this all year. They're a lot of fun to do. And this is the only active commercial producer in Washington right now. So if you wanted to try it for yourself, you can buy from Neil, although there are some other folks coming up on the scene that I'm really excited about as well. Neil sells out of his stuff pretty quickly. And the sap season's about to begin here. So if you're interested, you should keep an eye on it. I will skip over this. Suffice to say, we've made a lot of progress, but there's still a bit to go, especially around like manufacturing, equipment, and market development, stuff like that. But, we're continuing to get resources to build this out, and it's really exciting. The other example of adapted forest farming practices is forest cultivated mushrooms, particularly shiitake. So WSU Extension, myself, and a colleague, Justin O'Day, who's actually the lead on the project, have had trials in this going since 2019, trying to figure out, how can we adapt this practice that's traditional to Japan and the eastern U.S. more recently to our climate and our tree species, and how do we do it here efficiently in a way that can provide forest owners and farmers an opportunity, a low impact, low capital investment way to utilize woodlots and make supplemental income. We thought, we think this is a really great way to enhance a CSA, a farmer's market stand, roadside stand, that kind of stuff. So as I said, we've been hosting trials and having to overcome some things. One in particular is moisture management. The way that we differ from, areas east of the Mississippi, let's say, we have really dry summers, as Jared pointed out. The rain turns off and we don't get rain from, the end of June to the beginning of September, and it's really low relative humidity. So not having those summer rains and that summer humidity that's intrinsic to the Northeast and the Midwest and the South, it's really hard for fungal growth. So we've had to overcome that. I won't dig into really what we've come up with. Suffice to say, this is something we've focused a lot of attention on. Just doing a time check here. I'm moving along. Also looking at substrate. Like I said, we have different tree species here. We're conifer rich in the Northwest, but we're hardwood poor, I guess you could say. And so we have less to choose from, but we've trialed several species and we've got some real winners and some losers. Big leaf maple, not so good. So my fantasies of a big leaf maple syrup shiitake system have been dashed. But there's plenty of alder and Oregon oak and birch to go around, and they all seem to be pretty viable. And we added to our trials last year to try additional species as well. We were also able to take a scholarly visit to Japan this summer, which was amazing. And the idea was to be able to build connections, investigate new strains that would be more ideal for a dry climate, learn from established large-scale operations in research institutions. So we went to Oita, Miyazaki, Kumamoto, and Hokkaido. Visited lots of producers. This is a picture of one on the right. And just the scale of these systems is so beyond what we are going to be able to do in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, this is like a 10,000 bolt operation. So, we don't have the demand for that much shiitake in this area. But I could see, 500 to 1,000, bolts being feasible in our region as the market develops. And we wanted to be able to learn how to do this at scale. And so we learned so much from these producers it's just second nature to them at this point. They've just been doing it so long, but how they do this at scale. And it was a tremendously fruitful visit. And this is a co-op as well. We learned that, the co-ops there are really important for processing and marketing. And again, we're not there in the Pacific Northwest, but we could see how that role would be really important in the future. So again, looking forward, we're continuing the research. We got another grant to keep this going. And the biggest part I want to highlight is we are jump-starting 12 farms. And we got them started in 2023. They'll be doing their first harvest next year, and we're going to kind of follow them and learn how they market and see what kind of development needs to occur. But yeah, I'm really excited about this. And we'll also be developing a Pacific Northwest mushroom growers network to continue to support those growers. So, all right, I moved that pretty quickly, and we didn't leave time for questions for Jared's section either. So if people do have questions, they feel free to type them away in the chat. And I know that I think people will be transitioning to the next section soon. But Kate, do we still have time for questions?
Yeah, we have time for a couple questions. Patrick, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can add your contact information in, and then we can spotlight Jared.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Yeah, you can either add questions into the chat or MJ, do you want to call on folks?
Oh yeah, looks like there's a hand raised.
Sure. I'm seeing a hand from Daniel. If you want to just go ahead and unmute and ask a question, you can.
For sure. Thank you so much. Really lovely presentation. I kind of got in right at the end as I was switching over from the other webinar. Looking at the last picture where you had the stacked logs with the mushrooms. So this question is directed to Patrick. Has there been any integration to have multiple different models that are stacked, in the sense that in the Pacific Northwest, one of the things that I've been amazed by is nursery logs. I think that's one of the most incredible thing that I've been able to experience as a person coming from Montreal. And I was always wondering if it'd be possible to have a stack system where you implement nursery logs by creating some sort of like moss mixture, having saplings kind of grow, and then at the same time also able to harvest mushrooms. Is that something that's been thought out, tried?
I know that's a great idea. I had not heard of anyone doing that, but I don't know that you'd be able to do it on the same log, but it would be a really interesting model, especially to grow like hemlock, for instance, loves nurse logs, and that shade can be really beneficial to these systems. So I could definitely see a combine like inside that same space, nurse log / mushroom log system. It's a really interesting idea.
I'm wondering if it could help maybe with the moisture retention a bit more, or some sort of create, that extra little layer of vegetation over. Maybe that might be something to consider. Hats off to you. Thanks for the work.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And yeah, you're right. Shade is absolutely critical for the moisture retention. Looks like there's a question on, do you have any plans to combat the maple tree disease that's making the rounds in the US? And I'm not sure which one you're referring to, Talia. So if you maybe you can specify, because there's a couple different things, frankly, that are attacking maples, unfortunately.
I don't know a ton about it myself, but I've just been told that perhaps erroneously, maple trees are going to go the way of the ash tree in the next 10 or 20 years. So I was just wondering how that's going to impact future farming hopes for expanding maple syrup operations for small farmers.
Yeah, I think what you're thinking of is the Asian longhorn beetle, which is an invasive insect that attacks maples among many other tree families. And I think that it certainly is a concern, but I don't think I'm familiar enough with it to comment. I don't think it's really at the scale of like emerald ash borer and the damage it does to ash, which is like 90 to 100% mortality often. So yeah, sorry, not the best answer, but I know it is a concern, and certainly there's a lot of efforts to contain the Asian longhorn beetle where it is and prevent its spread.
Great, thanks.
If anyone else has more questions, they can just go ahead and unmute and ask them.
I think there was another question in the chat about whether or not we move the logs manually or use machines. And at the scale that we're doing it, we just use them manually. So it's also why we choose smaller logs generally, to avoid the back breaking part of it. But in Japan, they were using forklifts, and you saw those caged, with the rebar, and that was pretty important to be able to do it at scale.
And in addition to helping with the moisture management, I don't know if you have experience with this, Patrick, but there are a bunch of people that are taking like an alder tree that is already established and they're topping it and leaving maybe about 4 or 5 feet above the ground, and then the rootstock stays in the ground. So they just cut the top part of the tree off and then start plugging in. And I myself felled a couple alder the other day to start trying this to see if you leave the roots intact and then put in a bunch of spawn, what do you get out of it? And so I don't have any results yet because I just fell them last weekend. But I don't know, Patrick, if you have, I know I've seen other people do it, but I haven't seen any results from it yet.
Yeah, I've seen other people do that as well. And that's a really good sort of, it's a more passive way of harvesting because you're depending on like the seasonal rain to initiate the fruiting. So you'll use more cold weather strains of shiitake. The problem is, what we've determined is the best way to keep moisture in the log for long-term production is soaking, which is traditionally what you do to force fruit. The log, force the shiitake to fruit. And if it's on the stump, it's difficult, impossible to soak it, frankly. But it's totally functional from like a passive harvesting kind of way. And I've seen a lot of people do that just for like home use, personal use kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's how I'm using it. I've seen other people use it the same way. It's a completely passive system. You just let it go and see what happens.
And it's fun because you just go out in the woods and the shiitakes are out. So
yep.
All right. I think this was just a fascinating session. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I loved especially getting to see tours of, each of these sites. I'm going to invite everyone to wrap up the session. If you're interested in jumping over to the awards, those are going on right now. If not, I hope we will see you all at the top of the hour for the keynote. And thank you so much to Patrick and Jared for organizing the session and for sharing about your work. It was absolutely fascinating.
For having us.
Yeah, thank you.